The government is pretty shady. Are birds drones? Are they spying on us? What's going on here? What I do know is that they've done some shady, evil human experiments in the past. In fact, here are 10 that the government tried to cover up. Let's do it. Number 10, back pain. We'll kick this list off with a horrific prison deal, okay? Around the early 1970s, a lot of experiments rather, they would involve prisoners. And more often than not, they were considered horrible and inhumane. Congressional hearings in 1973 revealed some shady stuff about these pharmaceutical industry. Officials were actually using prisoners for testing because they were cheaper than chimpanzees at the time. Yeah, they were cheaper than animal testing. That's a loaded sentence. That's all bad right there. Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia specifically, they were a hot one. They did this a lot, sadly. Edward Yusef Anthony, a prisoner at the time who was actually featured in a book about all these horrible studies, he says he agreed to have a layer of skin peeled off of his back, which was then coated with searing chemicals in order to test this pharmaceutical. He did that for money to buy cigarettes in prison. It's terrible. He recalled weeks of intense itching and agonizing pain. I can't even imagine. All while serving time too. That's like the most bad. That's all bad. Number 9, Guatemala Studies. The Guatemala study is, again, horrible, as are all of these in this list, but I can't even imagine dealing with something life-altering already, like a prison sentence, and then having to be a test subject on top of that. This is just torture at that point. The study began in 1946. American scientists gathered not just prisoners, but patients as well, all residing in a mental hospital in Guatemala. They were then infected with syphilis in order to test whether penicillin could prevent STDs. The study was, of course, useless. It led to nothing but sickness for those that were forced to be involved. In a lot of these cases, many patients didn't fully understand what was happening. They couldn't give their full consent, of course. That's why they sadly went to them. Because nobody in their healthy mind would ever agree to something like this ever. It's disgusting. Number 8, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 71 conducted horrific experiments during World War II that definitely make the list. These experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was gruesome, of course, and extremely inhumane. Different medical schools and even universities provided these doctors and other research staff all to help conduct these experiments. It was a nice group effort done, and they used both prisoners and, again, civilians who didn't fully understand as subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments here that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them purposely with pathogens. They would purposely inject them with cholera or anthrax or perform operations without using any anesthesia. It was the worst of the worst. It all happened in Unit 731. Number 7, stomach test. Okay, I'll try and keep this list a little bit of a lighter note here. I'll try and bump it up a bit. This one's not as bad, if such a thing exists. Back in 1822, a fur trader in Michigan was accidentally hit in the stomach. But the trader was lucky to be treated by one Dr. William Beaumont. The fur trader survived, which already was a surprise given the, damage. But now they had this opened hole. They had this wound in his stomach that never heals. Now, this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity allowed a good peek at the digestive process. I feel so sick. I had breakfast 14 minutes ago. Awesome. So Dr. Beaumont began conducting experiments. He's like, let's use this horrible situation for science. He wanted to know how the stomach works, so he would tie food to a string and then insert said yum-yums through the hole in the trader's stomach. And then every few hours he would just pop the food out to observe how it had been digested. I feel so sick talking about this. Now that's the grossest thing I've ever heard personally, but these experiments did lead us to a worldwide knowledge that digestion was a chemical and not a mechanical process. So, guy's just stuffing pierogies in homeboy's stomach. He's like, someone ate it. I'm gonna throw up. Number 6, Operation Midnight Climax. Sounds like a funny name, but it's really not funny at all. Back in the 1950s, the CIA launched Operation Midnight Climax, ideally to study the effects of mind-altering substances on individuals. So in San Francisco and New York, subjects who again did not give consent or really know what was happening, they were tricked into participating. They were lured into safe houses by the, ladies of the night, but these women were actually secretly on the CIA's payroll. Yeah, they were calling in. They would work for the CIA secretly. They would give out these mind-altering substances, and then they would secretly watch from behind one-way glass. class. This was all found out and later thankfully shut down in 1965, and the CIA was busted for 1. Blackmail, 2. Surveillance technology, and 3. The use of mind-altering substances on the field. Yeah, can't do any of those. Number 5. Bobby, Eddy, and David. When Bobby Shafran was 19 years old, he found out that he had a twin this whole time. He found out he had a brother named Eddy. Now, this is usually fun, but, well, hang on here. The two were raised separately because they had been adopted at birth into different households, of course. But not too long after finding out about each other, things took a crazier turn when Bobby and Eddy found out they had another twin, a triplet rather, another brother named David. So it should have been a very joyous reunion for these triplets turned dark when they began to uncover the truth about what happened and why they'd spent all those years not knowing that each other existed this whole time. They were forced to be subjects in an experiment that they had no idea was taking place their entire lives, just in the background. Peter Newbar was a psychiatrist who wanted to study nature versus nurture, but he decided to do it in a cruel and unethical way. He believed that twins or triplets had a better chance of thriving in life if they were separated from their pair, and they wanted to prove this by unknowingly separating twins from each other at birth. Luckily, Bobby, Eddy, and David all found each other. Their story is documented in the movie The Three Identical Strangers. Number 4. MkUltra. Okay, where do I even start with this one? This was a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973. It's a very long time. They ran hundreds and hundreds of experiments to US citizens, and they gave them all mind-altering substances, you know, stuff I can't really say, all in attempts to crack mind control, or as they called it back then, information gathering. Nice. Hey, just hit that link down below. We're gonna gather some information. Keep your location on. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and North Korean agents were all using mind control, right? Why, of course. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. So these horrible tests were then being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, even prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was this huge, deep, long secret, and the agency destroyed most MK documents back in '73 when it ended. So we think we know a good amount, but there's probably so much horrible shit that we have no idea. Facial expressions experiment. Back in 1924, a psychologist at the University of Minnesota, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions and why we do them, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say, sounds a little bit silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of all these emotions were all the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone's face? What about sadness, or fear, or shock? But what about disgust, or anger, or excruciating pain? Yeah, all those dark ones too, you gotta look at. So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then he painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions and then compare the results. This is like a DC villain, this is horrible. This is all fine, I guess, except for what the stimuli actually contained. He wanted huge reactions because he included showing them adult films, exposing them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course he made them do horrible, inhumane things that I can't even talk about here on YouTube. All in the name of facial expressions and if they matched others. Number 2. The Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. Now, in a sort of mental health study, I guess if you want to call it that, Henry decided to induce depression into monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and their families and their mothers and put them into an isolation cage that was called the Pit of Despair. They even gave it a sad human name, like why just call it like the test cage. I don't know, so sad. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods, and other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed, of course, after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before it started. Now these monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things get even sadder, dare I say, than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and then rehabilitated. They just stayed depressed. Despite various forms of treatment, they were just unable to get to a place that they would have been had, they not been subjected to a cruel experiment. And finally, number 1, the Aversion Project. During the apartheid era in South Africa, psychologist Dr. Aubrey Levin was put in charge of curing gay men. Now, what I mean by that is that he was in charge of running these cruel experiments that targeted gay men for absolutely zero reason. There's zero science here at all. Guy's just a piece of shit. So sadly, thousands of gay men were imprisoned at the military hospital near Pretoria, and while they were there, they were subjected to electroconvulsive aversion therapy that was said to, again, reorient them, right? Now, part of this cruel therapy involves showing the men photos of naked males, encouraging them to fantasize, and then immediately subjecting them to severe shocks. Again, a horrible experiment that was based on zero scientific knowledge and purely based on hatred that was conducted by one horrible person. Now, once apartheid ended, this guy left South Africa because he was worried about being named as someone who denied people their human rights, but unfortunately he ended up fleeing over to Canada, where he then somehow found work as a doctor. Right here in Canada, where we're filming. We'll end on that terrifying note. I'm Taylor McWaters. Those are the top 10 evil human experiments that the government tried to cover up. Let's lighten the mood a bit. Let's talk shop down below. What's the worst job you've ever had? Like part-time job, you know what I mean? Let's talk a little bit about something else. Anything else. We'll see you next time, a most amazing top 10. Bye.